I spent 37 hours with something that watched me, without ever showing itself the way you expect a visitor to show. It did not land. It did not knock. It did not make a sound that could be recorded on any device I trusted for 4 decades. What it did was simpler and harder to prove. It answered to more than sight, and it seemed to respond to me. My name is Elias Moreno. I'm 58, retired from a career in land surveying. If that sounds like an odd credential for telling a story about being observed by something possibly not of this earth, understand this. Surveying teaches you to trust instruments, to read small signals without panic, to treat error as a clue rather than a catastrophe. For 38 years I set points that other people use to build roads and homes and bridges. I learned to listen to the silence between pulses and to reconcile a stubborn theodolite with a stubborn rock. If this story intrigues you, subscribe. More eyewitness accounts follow. I want to start where I always start when I write this down. The first anomaly. The place was Sierra Norte, a serrated sweep of ridges and eucalyptus-scented wind 3 hours from the nearest town. I had taken a short contract to redo some boundary points that had been flagged poorly during a rainy spring. The job was routine. A couple days of walking transects, setting up a tripod, taking azimuths, running tape for a line, logging control points. I drove in the old pickup, roof box clanking with spare batteries, my leather case of tools, the theodolite wrapped in an old military blanket. Theodolite being the instrument I still reach for in my sleep. For anyone who doesn't know, a theodolite is a precision optical instrument that measures horizontal and vertical angles. You align it on a point sight, you lock it down, you read the angle. It is pure geometry in brass and glass. You trust it because errors tend to have excuses, a loose mount, a warped tripod leg, a stone shifting. Rarely does a theodolite simply decide to ignore reality. The first night after the long day of walking and staking, I set the theodolite on a small bench of packed soil beneath a dead juniper, calibrated it against a known benchmark, and let it sit while I ate a cold can of stew under a sky that had a stupid, sharp clarity. I remember the way the air felt, compressed, as if the valley had learned to hold its breath. The radio, the one I keep for emergencies, had a thin hiss all evening. It was the kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full of the shape of waiting. When I went back to check bearings, the horizontal circle refused to move. Not sticky, frozen. The reading was at a perfect azimuth that looked toward open sky and nothing else. I thought, mechanical jam. I read the serial, I loosened the clamp, I checked the bubble level. The clamp turned, the setting mirror moved. Everything sounded right under the jaw of the instrument, but the digital output, the display where I usually log angles, kept spitting the same numbers at me like an insult. I unhitched the tripod and remounted the instrument on a different patch of ground a few meters away. It behaved for an hour. Then it didn't. The second time it jammed, the static on my radio dropped to nothing and a weight came into the air, like someone had set a lid over the valley. If I'm honest, the first thing I felt was anger. There's an instinct in us, trained or tribal, to name and then fix the thing that frustrates us. Anger is a tool. It sharpens focus. I bashed it a little, carefully, by wrenching the instrument out of its housing, checking the optical axis, feeling for hairline fractures with my fingertips. Nothing. I slept fitfully. Sleep in the mountains has always been a thin thing for me. Even when I worked on road projects, the nights were for counting mistakes and setting mental lists. This night, when I woke at some hour that might have been 1 in the morning or 3, time had already started its lazy trick. The theodolite was still pointing the same stubborn azimuth. I could have packed up then and gone home. I considered it. I had time pressure, a contracted deadline. But I also had something that had always been part of me since I learned to read instruments. The curiosity to know whether an error is an error or a sign. I left the theodolite where it was and walked the ridge until it was so dark I could not tell my boots from the cliff below. The next morning, when light came thin and metallic through the eucalypts, anomalies gripped the toolbox. The GPS units, 2 handheld units I trust like old dogs, gave positions that slid slowly in a way I'd never seen. Not an accuracy problem, not the usual multipath error where readings bounce off canyon walls, but a drift that tracked in counterintuitive ways. The compass ignored me for a while, then spun with a kind of circular laughter until it stabilized again. The laser level I used to flatten control lines flickered in intensity, like a distant lighthouse with inconsistent bulbs. I did what any sensible surveyor does when data goes wrong. I tested methodically. I isolated equipment, ran redundancy checks, swapped batteries, swapped devices, relogged observation times, set an independent reference by citing to a distant radio tower I could find on the topo map. I set up a series of experiments the way I once set up control points, with repetition and patience. First experiment, I placed the theodolite on the original azimuth and left it alone. I walked away to the second ridge, tripod and theodolite in the same case, and observed its readings from a distance. The instrument stayed at its jammed angle. Second experiment. I remounted the theodolite, but kept the optical axis aimed at the ground. It jammed again, this time with a different fixation. Third experiment. With the theodolite removed, I tested the GPS at 2 benchmarks. I logged coordinates, then went to a third point. The handhelds had the same sliding error. I made a note in my field book. Multiple devices, correlated time drift. It was around the middle of the second day that I noticed something else. While I was doing the methodical testing, I felt a frustration build inside me that had nothing to do with the instruments. The work was being obstructed, yes, but the annoyance felt like an extra weight added to the shoulder by an invisible hand. On a whim, half professional curiosity, half superstition, I changed my approach. I sat down on a flat rock, closed my eyes, took 10 long, slow breaths, and told myself to calm. I ran a little test in my head the way I would run a check on leveling. Breathe in, hold the position, breathe out, observe instrument. When I stood up and checked the theodolite, it had unclenched. The horizontal circle moved freely. The GPS units reported coordinates that matched the benchmarks within expected error. The compass pointed true north. For about 20 minutes, everything behaved as if nothing had happened. I tried an opposite test. I let my mind rot with irritation on purpose. I muttered at myself about wasted time, about contractors waiting, about how the valley seemed to be holding a mirror to my complacency. After 5 minutes of feeding my own annoyance, I checked the equipment again. The theodolite was back to its stubborn freeze. The GPS unit slid like a drunkard opposite the coordinates they had just held. I documented it in precise language. I am a man who writes numbers because numbers reassure me. I scribbled, correlation observed, increased agitation, heightened instrument error, increased calm, stabilization. I repeated the tests. I varied the breathing. I tried counting breaths aloud. I tried humming. I tried short prayers. Not to any god in particular, just audible sound, as if sound could be a calibration tool. The pattern persisted. This is where the ordinary and the extraordinary begin to tangle. It is tempting to render such a sequence as mystical, to say that presence calms the world. It is tempting also to try to reduce it to electromagnetics or environmental interference. Both impulses come from the same practical root, the desire to translate a phenomenon into the language you can measure. I kept both hunches in my pocket. I treated the relationship between my mood and the instruments as an experimental variable. I repeated sessions of agitation and calm and logged the outcomes. Each session was tiny. A 5-minute flare of anger produced a measurable jump in compass variation and GPS drift. 10 minutes of quiet, meditative breathing produced stabilization, lasting between 10 and 20 minutes. The effect was not absolute. It was probabilistic, like weather. Sometimes calm did not help. Sometimes instruments failed without any corresponding internal shift. But the more I tested, the more the statistical pattern tilted toward a dependence on my inner state. There were other signs that the valley itself responded to my presence and attention. The wind would die when I grew alert, as if the air itself learned to hush. Birds would cease their song. Once, while I was sitting with closed eyes practicing simple breath counts to test my hypothesis, I felt the hair along my forearms stand up as if a low, cool current had swept over me, the kind of current one might get passing under a bridge. I opened my eyes and saw nothing but the pale wash of sky. I rationalized. I didn't have to. Rationalization is a favorite weatherproof coat for surveyors, but the hair standing up left a mark on how I moved my hands afterward, the way a mark left by a hot pan shapes a cook's caution. Time began to change its usual property. Where previously I would have given my trials a neat chronological accounting, time stamps and arcs on a graph, hours became elastic. I would work for what seemed like an hour, and then find that the sun had sailed much further than I thought. Or I would sit for what felt like a long breath and discover only minutes had passed. There was a kind of subjective slip. The valley measured me as much as I measured it. That afternoon, I realized I was being watched in a way that bore no resemblance to human looking. There was no silhouette, no glow, no drone hum. It was a feeling of attention, of being under a gaze that registered not only the machinery and my actions, but the very cadence of my thoughts. It was an intimate and professional kind of wrong, like the way a patient's chest allows a doctor to hear a hidden irregularity. The observable variables were: instruments correlated with my state, environment shifted in response to my attention, subjective time dilated. None of these are proof of anything categorical. They are, however, data. I set up a more formal series of notes that night by the campfire, not because fire offered heat, though it did, but because the small, precise geometry of the flames helped me think in lines. I wrote in my field notebook in the same blocky script I used for control points. Excerpt, paraphrased. 1945, devices show correlated anomalies. 2020, calm breathing, stabilization. 2050, induced agitation, reboot of drift. Note, effect intervals average 12 to 18 minutes, environmental hush concurrent. Putting it in print on paper steadied me. There is power in the physicality of ink. It prevents your thoughts from playing tricks. They become measured, stamped with the weight of observation. The second evening, I tried to expand the test to social-level variables. I called a former colleague, Marcus, a man with the old practical bluntness that comforted me. Marcus still does quick topographic jobs and sometimes answers my neurotic calls. I told him little, that I was observing instrument anomalies and wanted a second opinion on plausible environmental causes. He was skeptical in that economic way only friends who have known you through decades of broken trucks and repairs can be. He mentioned solar flares as a joke, then wine shear, then cosmic rays, throwing out possibilities like a net. I did not tell him the bit about irritation and calm. I told him to come the next week, just to look at the equipment. He agreed, and we hung up. I felt the human map of my life anchor me to something reasonable again. As the hours tightened, I noticed another pattern. The instrument's misbehavior sometimes synchronized with a tiny, almost unnoticed shift in my pulse, not the big spikes you'd expect when scared, but a soft compression, like the muscles around my sternum deciding to hold a breath. That somatic compression coincided with a quick tightening in the instrument's readings. When I practiced allowing my stomach to breathe, to let the breath come from below instead of the chest, the instruments eased. It felt, against all my training, like an invitation to practice being small, to be a smoother point in the field. My old training had told me, reduce error, increase fidelity. Now the work was not to force the instrument into accordance with the land, but to adjust my inner state to allow the instruments to report without interference. There was a hum of moral unease in that discovery. To recognize that your inner state might influence devices is also to recognize that your inner state matters not merely to you, but maybe to whatever else is present. For a surveyor who spent a career ensuring the correct placement of property lines, who had sworn to measure without bias, this was an unmooring. The work had always been to make the outside world legible and fair. Now I was part of the equation in a way I had not accounted for. A living subjective variable whose presence might change the terms of measurement. That night I sat longer with the theodolite, not to coax it, but to see if being present could become a method. I recorded 2 long sessions of quiet presence. In one, I practiced breath. In the other, I let my thoughts go disorganized and watched their shape like weather. The instruments, staggeringly, tracked these inner differences. I began to treat my attention like a tool, not a blunt instrument, but a finely tuned gauge. Then came the moment that broke the habit of thinking this was solely a technical problem. About an hour into the second session, when I had allowed my mind to rest like a lake, the valley shifted. The silence that had been there before was now a pressure, a concentrated attentiveness. It was not malevolent. If anything, it was curious. Imagine standing on a dock and feeling the water look back at you. The feeling is intimate. It is not a command, but an examination. I am not a man given to metaphor when it matters. But in that moment I rehearsed old religious language, secular analogies, and technical descriptors, and found each of them inadequate. The nearest I can come is this. It was like being observed by a sentient field, attentive, cold as a lens, and patient. The instruments did not go crazy. They were quiet, as if listening too. If my business had been to survey land, then something else had turned the tables and placed me in a surveyed position. Those hours stretched. The usual comforts of self-assurance, my years of experience, my ability to isolate causes, frayed. I checked the batteries. I checked the calibration pins. I checked the serial numbers. The equipment passed every mechanical test. Yet the anomaly remained. A practical person in my position has 2 options: to retreat and leave the anomaly to mystery, or to stay and log. I chose the latter because logging confers a kind of moral safety. You are doing what you can. Recording, consulting, cataloging. Staying did not mean bravery. It meant accumulation of data. I sat, I logged, I waited. I lost any tidy sense of when the 37 hours began. For a long span, longer than it should have been, shorter than I wanted, it ceased to be a matter of counting hours and became a matter of attending. I stopped trying to fix the instruments and started to watch myself. When people ask what it felt like to be watched for those 37 hours, they expect drama. Something alien looming, a beam of light, a voice. That's not what happened. Most of it was silence. The watching was not loud. It was patient and attentive in a way that revealed things about me I had avoided for years. My useless thoughts, worries about unpaid taxes, a petty argument with a neighbor, the memory of my first child's cough, rose in my chest like little bubbles. Each one seemed to tinge the equipment in a small way. A flash of anger, and the compass needle spun. A loop of gratitude, and the GPS steadied. It was humiliating and clarifying. There were also distinct physical sensations. The first was a pressure, like a hand a finger broad across the crown of your head, but not physical. The second was time stretching. The third was a quieting of reflex. I noticed that when I made a conscious pause, when I inserted a deliberate space between seeing something and reacting, the instruments would often relax. It occurred to me then that perhaps the watchers were less interested in collecting data than in asking a question: how do you act when control fails? Do you panic, or can you remain present? The idea could be read as a benevolent test, a manipulative experiment, or a neutral observation. Whatever the case, it placed a moral weight on presence. To be present is, in this framing, to be accountable. At one point during what I now think of as the opening hours, I took a photograph. I did not expect it to show anything. The photograph was of the ridge and the sky, a flat horizon with a stray hawk, shot on my phone in low light. Later I would discover that other witnesses had photos that did not correspond clearly to any known object. For now, at that moment, the photograph was a ritual I used to mark time. I made notes in the margin of my field book that night. Observation. Phenomenon responds to internal modulation. Hypothesis. Presence reduces amplitude of anomalies. Action. Implement controlled presence periods of 10 to 20 minutes every hour. Record corresponding instrument behavior. I like lists because they are promises you can check off. I felt safer when I had a list. It would be dishonest to omit fear. The first 37 hours were not a serene retreat. There were moments of claustrophobia, of the kind that arrives when one recognizes that there may be forces beyond ordinary comprehension at play. There were also instances of startling beauty. A dawn that painted the valley with a light so precise it felt like revelation. A night sky so intense the Milky Way seemed to map a backbone across the heavens. Beauty and dread can coexist in tight quarters. They keep you honest. In the middle of those hours I found that a new language was necessary, not one built of angles and coordinates, but of breath and pause. The theodolite and the compass were not meaningless. They remained crucial instruments that offered data. But the principal instrument, as the experience matured, was myself. I became an instrument with a range of sensitivity. It is a disorienting thing to discover that you have become part of the measuring device. There are people who will read this and say, hallucination. There are others who will say, electromagnetic interference. Both are possible explanations. I do not set myself up as a prophet of either. I record. That is my profession and my ethic. I write what I measured, what I felt, and what I concluded at the time. Data points. Instruments correlated with inner state. Environment quieted when attention was calm. Subjective time elastic. Sensations of being observed. As the hours accumulated, I developed rituals to anchor myself against the strangeness. I would check the instruments every 30 minutes in a consistent manner. I would drink water at regular intervals. I would read aloud entries in my notebook to keep my voice from drifting. I would step outside the immediate site, walk a fixed 20 meters to the juniper and back, and then recheck alignment. I did not trust memory then, so I formalized it into procedure. On the third day of the anomalies, this is where the accounting of hours becomes slippery, because I could not always tell where one day ended and another began. I stopped trying to trap the phenomenon into being a thing I could fix. I stopped coaxing the theodolite into obedience. Instead, I sat down and kept quiet. I made an active practice of being present. I let thoughts pass like clouds, rather than flags that commanded response. It was during one of those long, quiet sessions that I noticed the most subtle thing. The instruments sometimes gave me a kind of answer to my inner state. Not a language of words, but feedback. When I was truly still, the instruments offered a steady heartbeat, a reliable series of small corrections that told me I was in alignment. When I was agitated, they flared. The pattern taught me something simple and profound. Whatever these observers were, they could measure motion and stillness not only in metal and magnetism, but in the way a person moves inside their own head. I am a practical man. I do not easily surrender to ideas that cannot be documented. But there is a kind of knowledge that comes from careful attention, and that is what I had, 37 hours of it, folded into my bones. I learned that it is possible to practice presence until it becomes less of a discipline and more like a posture you can wear into the world. That learning was not magical in the sense of a sudden epiphany. It was gradual, like a muscle strengthening through repeated, imperfect exercise, and still between my experiments and my breaths there were moments of naked panic. A sudden noise from the valley would jerk me upright, and in that jerk the instruments would misbehave. It was humiliating to discover that simple reflexes had consequences beyond my skin. It made the question of responsibility acute. If presence stabilizes things and reactivity destabilizes them, then what obligations do we have to cultivate our interior life for the sake of more than ourselves? On the fourth day, again, the counting is rough. I hit a memory that has stayed with me more than any other. In my notebook I wrote, 0430. They watch like an ecologist watches a herd. The line is clumsy and anthropomorphic. I have no evidence they were like ecologists or that they were they in the way we use the word to mark agency. But the sentence captures the sensation. I felt studied, catalogued, observed in a way that left one with the uncomfortable notion that my choices were not private. By the time the theodolite finally unclenched in a way that looked stable and the GPS drifted into ranges I expected, I had spent a concentrated stretch of hours practicing presence until it felt less like an exercise and more like a necessary state for survival. The 37 hours were not a neat block, rounded by a single turning point. They unfolded as a series of calibrations, failures, rejections, and small recoveries. When the instruments returned to their ordinary temper, I did not breathe a great sigh of relief. I had the strange sensation of leaving something behind that had changed me in ways I could not yet fully parse. That night, packing up some instruments and making a half-hearted plan to report the anomalies to the company, I paused by the ridge and looked back at the valley. The sky had the clear, brittle quality of high altitude. In that pause, the thought came, not as voice, but as a steady impression. What if this was not simply my valley, my instruments, or my ego, but part of a wider series of observations? The possibility was at once thrilling and terrifying. If true, it meant the rules were no longer only those I had learned on job sites and cadasters. It meant that presence mattered beyond my personal peace of mind. I left Sierra Norte with the theodolite in its case and my field notes filled with a new column, Internal State During Observation. On the drive home, I kept my hands on the wheel and tried to think in maps, a topographic reading of what had happened. The road cut through fog patches like a knife. My head buzzed with the small arithmetic of timing. If I had spent roughly 37 hours in contact, what did that mean for my home life, my responsibilities, the people who would not believe me? I did not come home to trumpets. My wife greeted me the way she greets most things I bring back from the field, with practical questions about dinner and how long until I would eat. I avoided big pronouncements. The phenomena I had observed were too odd for casual dinner-table conversation. I told her the bare facts about equipment failures and unusual interference. She listened, raising an eyebrow, and said what people who love you always say when you speak of strange things. Be careful. It was not dismissal. It was a small act of care. That night at home I could not sleep. Patterns of the instruments and my own reaction kept looping in my head, and I realized, with a clarity that had the quality of iron, that the rest of the story could not be contained to my notebook. For now, though, I needed to check my records, cross-reference times, and begin the process every surveyor knows well. Corroboration. You do not trust a single instrument. You need redundancy. Another set of eyes, another device, another person who can say, yes, I see it too. I opened the laptop and found a small community I had visited before. A private forum where people who dealt with anomalies, some technicians, some hobbyists, some people who had sat with strangeness, posted their notes. I did not expect much. Mostly these forums are full of noise. But I had an advantage. I had precise, dated notes, and I was trained in the way of careful logging. I typed a short, calibrated post, equipment malfunctions correlated with internal state, detailed times and device types, request for similar observances. It took less than an hour for a reply to arrive. The poster's name was short and anonymous. He, or she, wrote back with a simple line, "We call this a watch pattern. You're not the first to notice it." The words were brief and oddly formal. I bookmarked the reply and printed the page the old-fashioned way, I like paper, and set it beside my field book. Something in me shifted from private curiosity to the idea that this might be part of a pattern others had seen. The rest of that night I read with a kind of hungry caution. Most posts ranged from the credulous to the weary. People who had seen objects, people who had felt watched, people who had seen instruments misbehave, people who had started to train themselves into calm as a method. One thread contained a paraphrased excerpt from an internal-looking document someone had labeled Project Threshold, Leaked, Private. I read the paraphrase like a surveyor reads a shaky baseline, with skepticism but with the desire to see if the numbers lined up. The excerpt, clearly paraphrased because the poster did not provide an original file, spoke in clinical tones about multiple cases where devices showed correlated anomalies coinciding with human emotional spikes. It suggested that certain observation protocols could reduce amplitude of anomalies and that, in some cases, witnesses reported a sustained change in perception after prolonged contact. The provenance was unclear. The tone was bureaucratic and cautious. It could be a hoax, It could be a garbled release. It could be something genuine slowly leaking out through underfunded channels. I did not let myself leap to the headline. I printed the paraphrase, highlighted phrases that corresponded with my own notes, and made a careful column matching my times to the incidents described in the excerpt. The overlap was disquieting. I felt less alone and more part of a thread that extended beyond my little ridge. Late into the night I wrote another entry in my field book, the one I now keep next to my bedside when the world feels unsteady. Action: contact local colleague, Marcus, to review equipment logs. Post anonymized notes to forum with request for corroboration. Consider travel to meet other witnesses if patterns confirm. I folded the book closed like a map and tried to sleep, but sleep would not come easily. My mind had begun to catalog possibilities beyond instrument failure, that this could be part of systematic observation, that a broader set of people might be involved, that others had left clues in photos and anonymous posts. Morning arrived gray and cumbersome. I packed the truck again, though now I was less certain of what I was packing for. To prove a technical point, to chase an anomaly, to meet other witnesses, or to satisfy my own curiosity. The list of motives felt both honest and insufficient. I left the house with the theodolite on the passenger seat and the field book in my jacket. The valley behind me already felt like a place with its own memory. I kept glancing at the sky as if it had rearranged itself into a map I needed to read. The 37 hours were not a single event. They were an opening. I was walking through a door I had not intended to open. I drove toward town planning to stop at the cafe where local engineers and retired field hands gather. My plan was modest: mention the anomalies, see if anyone had similar stories. It was the beginning of something and yet not a conclusion. I parked at the little cafe on the edge of town with my theodolite case still at my feet. The place is called Aurora by locals because someone once thought the dawn there was worth a name. It smells of coffee and oil, and the men who gather at the counter are the sort who treat stories as tools, measured, useful, and sometimes blunt. I walked in, dust on my jacket, field book in the inside pocket, and sat at a corner table while the radio at the bar argued with a weather report. He was easy to spot: gray cap, hands that have held wrenches and maps for a long time. Roberto slid into the seat opposite me like he'd been expecting me, though he hadn't. There was a brief look of the kind that reads the shape of someone's day from the way they set their coat on the chair. He asked about my shoulder. He asked about the ride up. We traded the small civilities surveyors share, the types of tires we prefer, an anecdote about a creek that wore a bridge's footings down faster than anyone thought possible. Then, as those first small things ran out, I told him, sparing nothing of the equipment names but careful with the adjectives: the theodolite that jammed, the GPS drift, the compass that spun like it was laughing at me. Roberto listened in a way that made me trust him immediately. He has the slow, low skepticism of someone who has rebuilt engines and learned the taste of honest work. When I finished, he nodded, and then he slid a cheap photocopy across the table as if we were dividing a map rather than a rumor. "Someone dropped this at my door," he said. "Figured you'd like a look." The photocopy was a photograph of a ridge, white sky, faint tree line, with a small indistinct dark spot near the lower right corner, and a typed note at the bottom. Coordinates, a location name I recognized, and a date scrawled in a different hand, 03/02/2026. The figure in the corner was no bigger than a thumbnail, but it was there, a small human silhouette or little statue, impossible to tell. Someone had written in sloppy ink, "If you're seeing this before Feb, get ready." "Who sent it?" I asked. He shrugged. "No name, left in the mailbox. I didn't like the way it looked, so I brought it." We talked for hours, and our talk moved from the practical, how many batteries I'd used, whether I'd tried a different brand of handheld GPS, to the soft, strange place where technical curiosity bends into a question of meaning. Roberto told me about a forum he'd lurked in, an underground thread populated by electricians, old pilots, a few ex-military technicians, and ordinary people who'd had the odd knock at life's door. He had a printout of one thread, and he read aloud a few paraphrased posts. A woman who'd felt a cool pressure over her head while working alone at a lighthouse, a retired pilot who wrote about instruments going quiet in a particular corridor of sky, a geologist who said the rocks had quieted when she sat still for long enough. At some point, Roberto stopped and slid another sheet across the table. This one was a clipped excerpt, paraphrased, copied, and recopied, of something labeled in the margin as Project Threshold, leaked private. The language was bureaucratic and spare, the kind of non-committal tone a report uses when it does not want to be responsible for the opinions it collects. One line, paraphrased, unattributed, caught my eye. Subjects exposed to the phenomenon demonstrated intermittent instrument anomalies temporally correlated with somatic markers of increased agitation. Another line suggested that some subjects reported sustained shifts in perceptual acuity following prolonged observation periods. There was a caveat about insufficient sample sizes and a recommendation for further observational protocols. We both read it, silence folding across the table the way fog folds across a ridge. Roberto scratched the stubble along his jaw and said what men with practical experience often say when cogs refuse to mesh. If there's a pattern, we need to find it. If there isn't, we need to rule it out. He suggested I post a sanitized version of my field notes to the forum thread and see who replied. I agreed. That afternoon back at home I typed a careful dry account, what devices, what times, how I had tested agitation versus calm, and left the personal bits out, the parts that felt too private to give the internet. It took less than a day for replies to come. Some were dismissive, a surprising number were precise. Mag's post, whom I later learned was a woman geologist in her early 50s, described a similar pattern, instruments that hesitated in her presence during a field test in a coastal plateau, and then steadied when she practiced slow breath work. Another poster, a man who called himself Old Compass, wrote about receiving a small package of photographs from an anonymous source that included images marked with future dates. I do not trust the internet much, but I do trust a page that matches your own inked notes. The more posts I read, the less like an aberration my 37 hours felt. A week later, Roberto and I met Marcus on a hill overlooking a small reservoir. Marcus is a blunt man, the kind who says it's either that or it isn't, and moves on. He had read my online notes, and after a short glance at my theodolite and the way I set it up, he nodded and asked what annoyed me most about machines. For a brief second those days felt normal. 3 old men trading grievances about tools. Then the conversation folded inward again as we swapped the oddities. Roberto pulled out a manila envelope and, with a small ceremony that made the hair at the back of my neck prickle, removed another set of photographs. These were better prints than the photocopy, higher resolution, taken by a camera with a decent sensor. There were 4 of them. Each showed a different place, an abandoned transmitter site, a scrubby plain, a coastal bluff, and a slice of desert. Each had handwriting across the lower margin in the same ink, location coordinates, a terse instruction, and a date that was in the future. Different dates clustered across February and March 2026. One photograph stunned me. It was Sierra Norte, the same valley where I had slept under the theodolite and spent 37 hours being watched. The angle was low from a slope I recognized, and in the lower right a small figure stood looking toward the camera. The sunlight was flat and late. At the bottom someone had typed, "Revisit. Window, Febmar 2026. Someone had written in red ink, marked, "We pass the photos around the way you pass a blade at a table." Nobody wanted to say what the word marked meant, and nobody wanted to say what revisit entailed. No one claimed to know who shot the pictures. Roberto said he'd found the envelope in a drawer at a mechanic's shop down the road. The mechanic had said he'd found it in a box of mixed tools bought at auction. Mag, or the geologist who went by Mag, sent a private message saying her email had been flooded 2 weeks earlier with nearly identical photos, but with slightly different coordinates, and that the sender had refused to identify themselves. Old Compass wrote a note that read simply, "We're being cataloged." My immediate reaction was the practical one surveyors default to: verify. Check the EXIF on the images if you can. But the prints we had didn't contain digital metadata. They were reprints of reprints. The dates on the photos were written by hand. When I asked about this, Roberto shrugged. "You're asking me to be the archivist of odd things," he said. "That's not my day job, but I'll keep them safe." We began to form a loose pattern: photographs with coordinates, future dates, and the same handwriting, forum threads where people described similar instrument anomalies and promoted presence as a mitigation strategy, a scattered list of witnesses who preferred anonymity. There was an implication running through everything we had, that some process of observation was ongoing, and that certain people, those who'd been in the right place at the right time, or those whose emotional states produced certain signatures, had been noticed. Over the next month I traveled to meet a few of them. Mag met me at a small regional research station and recounted, in careful, measured sentences, the day her instruments fell quiet. She showed me notes she'd taken, photocopies on a clipboard, pencil circles around times, and she let me see how her pulse and breath had aligned with the steadiness of her readings. Roberto introduced me, through another contact, to a man who'd spent years as an engineer in communications. This man, whose name I learned later, brought a box of log files and a skepticism so brittle I nearly snapped it in half. He did not convert easily. Each meeting followed the same rhythm: a conservative review of the data, a kind of mutual sanity check, an exchange of printouts, and then, gradually, the admission of something softer, an experience of being watched, a photograph that did not add up, a feeling that one's thoughts were not entirely private when in a certain space. People ask the obvious question: what are they? Are they extraterrestrial in origin? Are they some electromagnetic field we do not understand? Is it mass hysteria? There were no good answers, only patterns. It was in one of these sessions, an evening at the Aurora Café with Mag, Roberto, and 2 others, that the possibility of a coordinated meeting came up. Someone in the forum had suggested that those who had similar experiences should meet in person to compare notes in a place where anomalies had been reported. The idea took root because the photographs suggested a window, and windows invite action. The group decided to attempt a modest, structured meeting at Sierra Norte during the noted window, coordinate arrival times, agree on simple protocols for testing, and practice presence exercises together. I did not expect to feel anything like fear when we planned it, but there was a pressure in my chest the night I agreed to return. This was not only about curiosity, it was about preparation. If something noticed patterns in us, if observation correlated with internal states and instruments, then it mattered who we were inside. There was an ethical weight to that idea. If our interior life could influence external measures, perhaps we had responsibilities that reached beyond ourselves. It felt absurd to think of it as duty, yet duty was the only word that held the gravity of it. In the intervening months, I read the paraphrased Project Threshold material more carefully. The leak, if it was a leak, sounded like notes compiled by technicians who had been briefed about anomalous events. The most unsettling paragraph was clinical and short. Cases present with correlated instrument anomalies during subjective reports of observed attentional focus. Post-exposure periods sometimes include altered perceptual sensitivity, increased incidence of synchronic events, and a small subset reporting lasting changes in reactivity. Note: potential ethical implications concerning subject privacy and inadvertent influence on observed environments. The line about ethical implications was underlined in someone's photocopy. That underlining struck me the way frost bites a leaf. It suggested a human problem at the core of any technological puzzle: privacy. If you are being observed, who owns the record of that observation? Is it the watchers, the watched, or neither? And what about selection? Are people marked for reasons we cannot see? The photocopied document offered no reassuring answers. It only catalogued concerns for more study. Around this time, an anonymous message arrived in my forum inbox with a single attachment: a small cluster of photographs and a terse note. The photographs were the familiar mix: valley angles, coastal bluffs, transmitter sites, but one of them had been postmarked December 2025 and bore a date stamped on it in a shaky font: June 14, 2026. The note read, "Window predicted by multiple independent observations. Consider presence training." I showed Roberto and a few others. The conversation that followed was practical. How to get there, what gear to bring, who could carve time from their schedules. The moral conversation was harder. Who had the right to be there? Were we intruding on whatever observation was happening? Were we making ourselves targets by being curious? We put those questions into the group folder as an agenda, and then, because humans find solace in work, began to prepare logistics. Preparation felt like an old-fashioned survey plan. We drew a list. We tested batteries, counted spare fuses, plotted routes with contingency stops. But we also made another list, the interior list. We prescribed practices, morning meditations, simple breath exercises, and a 2-week protocol for cultivating presence. I found myself, for the first time since my job required it, writing an instruction manual about being still. The packing list reads like a compromise between practicality and ritual. 2 theodolites, 1 mine and 1 older model Roberto found, 3 handheld GPS units, a manual compass for redundancy, a laser level, external battery packs, a water filter, a field tent, adequate food, a small first aid kit, notebooks and pens in triplicate, a pack of printed photographs and copies of the forum thread, and a physical printout of the paraphrased Project Threshold excerpt. We included personal items too, a photograph of family for each of us, because you pack what you are, an extra sweater against unexpected cold, and a small ritual item each person chose to carry, a coin, a rosary, a smooth stone, as a focus in case panic rose. We also created a testing protocol. Every 30 minutes, for a specified period of observation, one person would take a standard set of readings: theodolite azimuth, GPS coordinates, compass heading, a short note of their pulse rate, and a self-ranked emotional state from 1 to 5. We would keep exact times on the log, cross-reference devices, and repeat the cycle. The aim was both scientific and practical, to produce data and to practice being in the space without losing ourselves. In private, though, I was still recording notes that sounded less like a lab manual and more like a confession. My notebook entries began to wobble between the two. One night I wrote, "Presence is an ethic as much as a technique. I was trained to be precise in reading the world. Now precision is required in reading myself." I underlined the sentence twice. The weeks leading up to the proposed window were a study in restraint. There was a public calendar marked OT-203-2026 in the group's folder, but no one wanted to make definitive claims. We all understood the danger of certainty, yet the photographs, the forum posts, and the paraphrased report were enough to draw people together. Attendance was modest, but dedicated. Roberto, Mag, a young woman who worked in telecommunications and asked to be called L, and an old technician who spoke in data points, and me. Marcus tried to come, but his job would not allow more than a weekend. Others who had been more vocal online remained anonymous, sending notes and supplies without wanting to be seen. The trip back to Sierra Norte the second time was quieter inside me than the first. The road had a rhythm I could measure with the sweep of the steering wheel. The valley rose like a wound patching itself, familiar and altered. When we arrived, the group set up camp near my old bench under the juniper. The theodolites went up like honest flags. We tested and calibrated in the way surveyors do, carefully, repeatedly, with attention to the tiniest movements. The first nights were practice. We practiced being together in the same field as the instruments, and we practiced being alone in the field of our own attention. There were small humiliations and small victories. Elle lost her temper once when a GPS unit refused to lock. She swore, and the device drifted badly for 15 minutes. Then she sat and did the breathing exercise we had practiced for a week. Slow, diaphragmatic breaths, and within 20 minutes her measurements steadied. The old technician, who had a face like a chiseled map, said nothing. He simply logged the time and made a terse notation in his book. The logging protocol brought a steadiness to the camp. Entries lined up like contour lines on a map. If anything, the presence of other witnesses eased my loneliness. It was less that they vindicated me, and more that they reframed anomaly into a community problem. When something odd occurred, a gust of wind that came from no visible direction, a radio that failed to pick up a signal in a band it had always handled. We had witnesses to say, "Yes, that just happened," and we could fold it into the day's work. At one of our shared dinners under a pale moon, Mag read aloud a message she'd received from a forum member who asked questions instead of giving answers, questions that had the feel of someone trying to make an argument with an underwater current. "Do you think," the message asked, "that being marked obliges one to be a caretaker? If your inner state changes things, is cultivating calm a private habit or a public duty?" She paused at the line as if testing its weight on the table. We argued the point like old friends. Marcus, who had joined us for a few days despite his earlier constraints, said, "You can't legislate the heart." The old technician countered that training could be taught like any other skill. Roberto, who had a way of listening that involved not speaking until the right sentence had had time to swell, said, "Absent evidence, the only reasonable way forward is to practice being less easily disturbed." The conversation circled around the question of agency. Were we responsible for being stable if our instability could ripple outward? We didn't agree, but we all felt the gravity. On the 6th night, we found a small notebook tucked into a cavity near a cairn on a ridge. The notebook contained a short entry written in a hurried hand. Marked at coordinates. Presence required. They monitor reactions. Calmness correlates with reduced amplitude. Be careful who you bring. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Whether it had been left deliberately or accidentally, we could not tell. The sentence, "Be careful who you bring," felt like an admonition and a warning folded together. We talked about it, then tucked the notebook into a shared log. Ethical questions returned like tides. The word selection now occupied more of our conversation. Selection of people. Selection of moments. Selection of responses. We wondered if the watchers were cataloging certain kinds of human behavior in a way that meant some individuals would be called forward and others left out. The possibility felt invasive. "Privacy," someone muttered, "is now not just about what you write on a ledger, but about what your body gives away." To complicate matters further, small synchronicities began to cluster. I would think of a person, and 2 hours later receive a call from them. Marcus ran into a former colleague whose description of a day in a radio tower included the same odd silence we had noticed in the valley. Mag found a list of coordinates pinned to a community bulletin board in a town 3 counties away. Coordinates that matched some of the photos we had received. Each coincidence by itself could be written off as chance. Together they suggested a pattern that tugged at the edge of probability. As the dates in the photographs drew nearer, our group tightened its procedures. We adopted a shared language for what to do when instruments misbehaved. Stop, breathe, log, move. We set up a simple code, one not meant to be secret, but meant to anchor us when stress rose. Stop meant cease activity and take a breath. Breathe meant a minute of slow diaphragmatic breaths. Log meant note time, device state, and internal feeling. Move meant physically stepping 20 meters from the instrument to disrupt any localized effect. These steps were basic, and they gave us a ritualized way to respond that replaced reflexive panic. In my fieldbook, I created a compact protocol template and copied it onto laminated cards for everyone. 1. Check gear. 2. Record baseline. 3. Practice presence. 4. Observe for 15 to 20 minutes. 5. If anomaly occurs, execute stop, breathe, log, move. 6. Repeat cycle. We treated this like a safety drill. It was practical, and it was also, in a strange way, moral. One evening, as the calendar edged closer to February, someone brought up the word veil. It had appeared in the forum from time to time, always accompanied by a hedging clause, that some there called it metaphorically, others literally. The paraphrased Project Threshold material had been careful around it. Temporary modulation of perception was their phrase. Yet the forums used veil like a name, something that hides and occasionally slips. Someone suggested that in February-March 2026 there might be a brief window when that veil thins. The date echoed in camp like a bell with missing notes. We could not verify that claim. The photographs and threads hinted at it. The paraphrased document suggested only that there were windows of increased incidence in prior datasets. So we held both possibilities, that a window might exist and that the dates could be coincidence. Our preparation became a meditation on responsibility rather than a gamble on a spectacle. In the last week before the earliest photograph date, I tightened my own practice. I began to keep a morning log where I noted 3 things. One small kindness I had extended the day before, one thing that made me anxious, and one breath practice I intended to do that morning. The exercise was modest but disciplined. It trained me to begin the day with a calibrated self-inspection, rather than with whatever jerked to the top of my mind. The effect was not instant transcendence. It produced small reductions in surprise, a narrowing of reactivity like adjusting a lens. Our small group convened on the evening of February 1st and reviewed the plan. We would be in Sierra Norte during the dates suggested in the photographs. We would avoid attention as much as possible. No banners, no interviews, no social media posts that might attract people who would not respect the space. We would practice presence and keep careful logs. We would be humble and prepared to leave if things felt unsafe. We agreed on a basic code. No speculation to outsiders, no claims beyond we observed anomalies, and always the stop-breathe log move protocol. The night before the window opened, I sat by the small camp stove and wrote a long entry that felt like both prayer and ledger. If being present matters, then training presence is not self-indulgence. It is stewardship. I considered the ways my life had been quieted and lauded by this whole affair. The small joys of noticing the way light hits a lichen, the acute pain of seeing my reflexes ripple instruments, the way my family learned to listen to my tiredness with a new patience. The notebook was a confessional and a map. We entered the window days with a mixture of ritual and skepticism. The valley kept its usual weather. Some wind, a sun that flattened the ridgelines mid-afternoon, an occasional wash of rain that left the soil smelling like clean iron. Instruments did odd things. Our logs recorded more drifts and pauses than a week earlier. We executed stop-breathe log move routines with a calm that felt like muscle memory. When the group sat in a circle for guided breath practice, 2 minutes of counted breaths, a short interval of silence, then gentle re-entry, there was a sense of being a small, buoyant fleet keeping station on an uncertain sea. Nothing dramatic occurred in the sense of lights in the sky. There was no cinematic visitation. The phenomenon, if that is what it was, continued mostly in the small, a slight deepening of silence, a brief pause in the birdsong, a moment where the campfire felt like a deliberate geometry rather than a random blaze. With other witnesses present, the experience felt less like being singled out, and more like being one chord in a field of observation. On one afternoon, after an extended session of instruments testing, where our records confirmed subtle correlations between our internal states and device outputs, Roberto and I walked out to the old bench where my 37-hour encounter had begun. He had been quiet for a long while. Finally he said, "Do you think they care if we know?" I thought about the phrasing. Care could mean many things. Care implies emotion and interest. It implies an ethics of attention. But care can also mean, are they tracking intentionally? That was a more loaded question. I told him the truth I had come to trust. They respond to what they observe. Whether that is care or calibration, I don't know. But our reaction matters. He nodded and tightened his cap against the sun. "Then we owe it to ourselves to be better at this," he said. "To be kinder, quieter, steadier. If nothing else, for our own lives." The days blurred into a rhythm of observation and practice. We shared small victories. A GPS unit that had drifted during an argument steadied when the persons involved took a deliberate break and practiced breathing. A compass that had spun ceased when a field of witnesses took turns in silence. Those were not miracles. They were correlations. But correlations taught us something. Practice had an effect. The sort of practice we were doing was not religious or magical in a guaranteed way. It was a disciplined training of attention that changed how we responded. I found myself thinking about selection again. If the watchers were cataloging behavior, were they interested in calm people because such people were stable and useful, or because the contrast between inner chaos and outer order made for better data. The question returned to ethics. If someone was marked because of their sensitivity, did we then owe them protection? It was a moral tangle with no easy string to pull. As February moved toward March, our small group dispersed back to lives that required bills paid and families tended. We kept in touch in an old-fashioned way: telephone calls at odd hours, emails with concise log attachments, a shared folder with photographs and time-stamped notes. Marcus returned to the day job, but he texted when he could and sent a packet of fresh batteries and a note that said, "If you find anything that looks like trouble, get out. No point in being courageous if it's reckless." In late March, on a weekday that began gray and finished bright, I received an email that made me stop in the middle of a grocery aisle. The subject line was a single phrase: "Photos attached, 02/14/2026. It contained 3 images, anonymous but clear. One showed a ridge with a small figure, much like the others we had seen, but this time the figure wore a jacket with a patch, an old surveying company logo I had seen in faded photographs of my youth. The file names had been stripped of metadata, and the sender was anonymous. The message itself simply read, "They pick those who stay. Watch your breath." I kept the phone in my hand and leaned against the cereal shelf. The message felt like a manual strike, both a caution and a confirmation of something we had intuited already. I closed my eyes and felt my pulse slow as I breathed deliberately. The world did not change. Yet I felt steadier in the world, as if the small habit of pausing had redistributed some of my nervous energy. Months have passed since those photographs arrived. In some ways, the world has gone on unchanged. People go to work, children grow tired and then sleepy, seasons shift on their schedules. In other ways, everything has shifted. I am less reactive by degrees that accumulate like sediment. I notice things with a clarity that sometimes frightens me. A neighbor's face when they are hiding grief. A clerk's hands when they are weary. My own body has become a gauge I consult more often than I would like. It is not that I claim special powers or clearer sight. It is that the 37 hours taught me how quickly the interior can ripple the exterior. I have tested these habits in mundane places. In a supermarket, when someone cut ahead of me and anger rose, I stopped, inhaled, and let the irritation pass. The items on the conveyor belt remained in the same order, and so did the cashier's voice. I have tried the presence practice while driving. It does not create miracles. Cars still scare drivers, and deer still cross roads in the wrong places. But it reduces a certain kind of mechanical fury that multiplies small errors into bigger ones. There are small synchronicities still. A few months after the Sierra Norte window, I received a phone call from Marcus at an odd hour. He had been fixing a fence and found in a hollow a bundle of old printouts tied with twine. Inside were photocopies of posts from the same forum and a photograph with the same handwriting we had seen months before. Marcus laughed the dry laugh of a man who has found yet another loose thread. "Either we're in a plot," he said, "or the world's printing out little notes to itself. Either way, keep breathing." Part of the aftermath is sociological. The people I met, Roberto, Mag, Elle, Marcus, have formed a network that acts like a neighborhood watch for oddities. We check in, swap notes, and offer practical support. We are not a cult. We do not have manifesto or hierarchy. We are a handful of old technicians and a few curious neighbors who share a belief in the utility of disciplined attention. We have ethical rules we return to. Do no harm. Protect privacy. Do not circulate identifying information and refuse to monetize the discomfort of others. That last point is important because it leads me to be clear about what I offer now. There are people who send messages asking if I have a cure, a method to guarantee protection, an address to punch in and call the whole thing off. I do not. I have habits and exercises that helped me, a community that supports what we do, and a booklet I wrote out of a slow desire to give people a starting place. It is called Modestly Reconnecting Practice, a set of presence exercises grounded in simple breath and observational logs. It is not a cure. It is a set of tools for practice, for steadying oneself in a moment of uncertainty. Before I close, I want to give you something concrete you can try at home. It is a simple 2-week protocol, practical, short, and designed to cultivate habits of presence without requiring a retreat or expensive equipment. I suggest you try it, not because I promise anything will change in the world, but because practice changed my own responses in measurable ways, and because, if something like what I encountered is real, small changes in reactivity could matter beyond you. 2-week presence protocol. Simple, practical steps you can record in a notebook. Day 1 per 3. Baseline. Each morning write 3 items. 1 small thing you are grateful for, 1 worry you are willing to note, and 1 intention for presence that day. Each evening write a short note, 3 lines, about where your attention wandered most. Practice 3 moments of diaphragmatic breathing a day. Inhale for 4, hold 1, exhale for 6, each lasting 1 minute. Day 4 to 7. Micro-checks. Continue the morning and evening logs. Add 4 micro-checks during the day. Set your phone alarm or a sticky note reminder, and when it goes off, pause 30 seconds, take 2 slow breaths, and rate your internal state from 1 to 5. 1 calm, 5 agitated. Note any corresponding events, e.g. an email, a phone call, a traffic jam. Day 8-11. Response training. Continue the prior exercises. When you notice agitation, implement the stop, breathe, log, move sequence. Stop what you are doing. Take a minute of diaphragmatic breaths, make a single-line log entry of what triggered the feeling, and physically move, stand up, step outside, change your posture to break automatic reflexes. Day 12 to 14. Integration. Maintain the practices and add a nightly reflection. Write what changed across the 2 weeks, if anything, and list 2 concrete acts of presence you will keep going forward. Keep the habit of morning note-taking. It anchors the day and turns attention into a practical discipline. These are small methods. They do not guarantee safety, understanding, or supernatural protection. They do, in my experience, increase awareness and decrease reflexive reactivity. They give you a better chance to be the kind of person who notices and pauses before acting. That seems at the moment to be the essential work. I want to close with something I learned the hard way across these months. Being watched was not only about an external intelligence, it was also about becoming part of a larger system in which my interior had measurable consequences. The moments that mattered were not the ones with the most spectacle, but the ones where I chose to pause, to breathe, and to act with less haste. There is a responsibility there that is both personal and public. Personal because you must mind your own interior life. Public because your interior life might ripple outward in ways you do not control. I will not promise you certainties about 2026, about veils falling, about global events. The photographs we found, the forum threads, the paraphrased project threshold notes, all suggest that there are patterns worth taking seriously. They do not amount to proof of anything apocalyptic, nor do they guarantee a future event. What they did do for me was show that practice, presence, yielded measurable changes in how I interacted with instruments and with people. For that, I remain grateful and cautious. If you are curious and want to explore the practices I described in more depth, I've put together a concise guidebook with expanded exercises, logs you can print and use, and further reflections on ethical practice. It's called Reconnecting Practice. I also offer private sessions for those who want personalized guidance in cultivating presence. These are aimed at committed practice, not quick fixes. If you choose to look into them, you will find clear boundaries, no promises of miracles, no medical claims, and a focus on steady, repeatable practices that support attentional calm and resilience. This story, my 37-hour encounter with aliens, will not untangle the world for you. It did not untangle it for me. But it taught me that attentional discipline matters in ways I had not imagined when I spent a lifetime trusting brass and glass. If anything else, it reminded me that being observed can be a mirror that asks whether you will become the kind of person who steadies not only instruments, but communities. If you've read this far, thank you for the time you've given. If the account resonates, Consider the 2-week practice. Small acts stack into habits, and habits shape the world in ways we rarely measure until later. I'll keep logging, and I'll keep listening. If our paths converge in Sierra Norte someday, I'll bring an extra notebook and a set of batteries. Until then, breathe, record, and be steady. Elias Moreno.